Hello, friends. Tonight we journey back into a world where the only thing more terrifying than your enemies was your own ruler. Imagine waking up in a stone room, the scent of burning tallow lingering in the air, the cries of morning market sellers wafting through narrow streets, and knowing that one wrong glance could be your last. Because tonight, we're stepping into a realm ruled by fear, firelight, and the kind of leadership that makes modern office politics look like a group hug. And once you're in, well, you might not find your way back out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And don't forget to comment below with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing all the corners of the globe this little history club connects. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a small fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin our journey tonight. Let me take you first to the region of Belgravia, a small principality nestled in the Balkans. It's the 15th century, and Europe is a patchwork of kingdoms, fiefdoms, and really bad decisions. Most people are just trying to grow turnips without being raided, taxed, or recruited into someone else's bad idea. But in Belgravia, something, or rather someone, is about to change everything. Enter Rurik of House Krosfen. Born in 1431, Rurik wasn't just any nobleman. He belonged to a long-standing family of regional rulers known for being, let's say, ambitious. His family crest probably included a dagger, a suspiciously smiling crow, and the phrase, "You'll regret this." From an early age, Rurik's life was more plot twist than fairy tale. His father, King Dravos, was assassinated when Rurik was still a boy, likely over one of those cheerful power disputes that always seem to involve poison or staircases. Following that tragedy, Rurik and his younger brother were handed over as guests to the Ottoman Empire. Now, in modern terms, that would be called hostage diplomacy. Back then, it was just Tuesday. The Ottoman court was a marvel of architecture, politics, and the kind of disciplinary practices that made timeout corners seem laughably quaint. While there, Rurik was exposed to the empire's methods of warfare, punishment, and population management, methods that were, shall we say, creatively intense. Among them, one stood out, the spectacle of impalement, a brutal, slow, and horrifyingly efficient form of punishment. And like a student taking notes at a lecture he shouldn't enjoy, Rurik paid very close attention. Years passed. Rurik grew into a young man shaped by suspicion, survival, and a seething resentment for the empire that had held him captive. When he finally returned to Belgravia in 1448, he found a homeland in chaos. Civil factions were squabbling like drunken uncles at a wedding. Neighbors, namely the Hungarians and Ottomans, were pressing at the borders. The throne was technically his, but in practice it was just a fancy chair no one respected. That changed quickly. Rurik's first act upon reclaiming his position was to throw a massive banquet. Nobles, advisors, and anyone who'd ever muttered, "I think I'd make a better king," were invited. The hall was lavish, filled with roasted game, dripping candles, and the kind of awkwardly forced small talk that always precedes something terrible. And then, at a signal, Rurik's guards stormed the hall. Every guest, some still chewing, was seized and marched out to a nearby field. There, under the pale moonlight and the sounds of their own disbelief, they were impaled. Not metaphorically, very literally. That night, Belgravia lost a large chunk of its political class and gained a ruler who wasn't interested in discussion. This was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Rurik's reign would become infamous. His methods of punishment weren't just designed for efficiency, they were designed for memory. He employed public execution with such variety and theatricality that even his enemies had to grudgingly admit the man had flair. Tales of citizens being boiled alive for theft, or forced to consume their own severed body parts, an act so nightmarish it would have Freud retiring early. Even rumors of him dining amidst the results of his justice, enjoying his evening meal in the company of those who wouldn't be needing dessert. Not because it thrilled him, but because it warned everyone else. One particularly chilling episode involved a delegation of Ottoman envoys. As tradition dictated, they wore their ceremonial head coverings in Rurik's presence. He asked them to remove them. They declined, citing religious custom. So naturally, he honored their traditions by having their turbans nailed to their skulls. Some might call that overreaction. Rurik would probably have called it Tuesday. But here's the twist. As terrifying as he was, Rurik wasn't just acting out of sadism. This was strategy. He understood the currency of fear. He weaponized reputation. His brutality wasn't random. It was systematic, symbolic, and spectacular. A form of rule that made disobedience not just dangerous, but unthinkable. And it worked. For a time, Belgravia, for all its terror, stabilized. Raids decreased, order was restored, trade paradoxically improved. Because under Rurik, everyone knew the rules. Break them, and there was no appeal process. His reputation spread far beyond his borders. Tales of his justice crossed mountains, whispered in inns, markets, and war camps. Other rulers may have had crowns, armies, or blessings from the church. Rurik had fear, and in that age, it was often more effective. But as we'll see soon, power built on terror is a blade with two edges, and one day, even Rurik's shadow would stretch too far. Let's pause here. When you're ready to dive deeper into this chilling chapter of history, just say the word. Until then, rest easy, if you can. The morning after Rurik's banquet of infamy, Belgravia awoke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows an earthquake, when everyone's still counting who's left standing. The nobles were gone, the court was gutted, and standing atop the social wreckage was a man with a very clear message. This kingdom now has one voice, and it is mine. Rurik didn't rule with words, he ruled with symbols. His next years on the throne were not defined by reform or diplomacy, but by a very public campaign of demonstration. He understood something many kings didn't. People fear spectacle more than they fear whispers. That's why, just a month after his dramatic purge, he began constructing what would become one of the most talked about innovations in regional justice, the field of posts. A wide open area outside the capital where stakes rose from the ground like a twisted forest. It wasn't hidden, quite the opposite. It was visible from the main trade road, from the hilltop church, even from the market square if you squinted. And it was never empty. Travelers passed it with bowed heads. Children were warned not to ask questions. And Rurik, he reportedly walked through the rows sometimes at dusk, hands behind his back like he was inspecting a garden. A very still, very silent garden. But not every execution was about drama. Some were deeply personal. One such incident involved a small village that failed to pay its annual tax, not because they refused, but because bandits had looted the collection caravan. Rurik, rather than pursue the thieves, pursued the village. He summoned the village elder to court, listened patiently to his trembling explanation, and then sentenced the man to education. In the town square, a large cauldron was set up. The elder was placed nearby, and Rurik addressed the crowd. This is what happens when you lose track of your responsibilities. The cauldron, filled with water, was slowly heated beneath a low fire. It wasn't about causing pain quickly. It was about making sure every person watching remembered this lesson for the rest of their lives. And they did. Then there was the tale of the carpenter who dared joke about the king's unusual taste in architecture, a jest whispered to a friend over some watered ale. That friend, loyal or frightened, reported it. The carpenter was given a choice: recant and lose his tongue, or repeat the joke aloud in front of the court and face a consequence yet unnamed. He chose silence. The court never heard the joke, but they heard the scream that followed. Now, not every day was that grim. Some were simply unsettling. There were reports that Rurik would dine alone at a long table with empty chairs set for those who had betrayed him. He would talk to them, toast them. On one occasion, he was said to have left the table mid-meal, walked outside, and ordered the arrest of 3 former officials whose names he'd just spoken over wine. Were these men guilty? Perhaps. Or perhaps Rurik had simply remembered a dream. With him, memory and decree were often the same thing. One foreign ambassador visiting from the West noted how quiet the capital city felt. "There is peace here," he wrote, "but it is the kind that stands very still, afraid to breathe." And then came the incident with the envoys. Rurik had been in tense negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, whose diplomats arrived wearing their traditional head coverings. As was custom, they refused to remove them, even indoors, as a sign of piety. Rurik smiled at this. He said he respected tradition, and then reportedly he ensured those turbans would never leave their heads. This act sent ripples across the region. Some called it blasphemy, others called it brilliance, but no one called it forgettable. Still, the question must be asked, was Rurik simply cruel, or was he calculated? Because for all the darkness, one truth cannot be denied. Under his rule, Belgravia grew quieter, banditry declined, roads became safer. Merchants, once hesitant to trade in the region, returned. The coin flowed again. Order, however harsh, had returned. But stability built on fear has an expiration date. By the early 1460s, Rurik had made enemies in every direction. Hungary, tired of his growing confidence, finally acted. They captured him during a skirmish near the border, a bold move given his notoriety. He was not paraded through the streets. There was no public gloating, just a quiet disappearance into a foreign prison. For over 10 years, he vanished from the world's stage. Some said he had died. Others believed he was being held in secret, consulted like a dangerous oracle. The truth? He waited and planned. In 1476, now in his mid-40s, Rurik returned to Belgravia. The throne was empty, the chaos had returned, and though his body was worn, his resolve was unchanged. But this time, the enemies were faster. Within months of his return, Rurik found himself on the battlefield, once again facing the Ottoman forces that had shaped him. This time, he would not survive. He was struck down in the fray. Some say he fell silently, others say he cursed the sky. But all agree, he died with his sword drawn and no hint of retreat. And that should have been the end. But Rurik's story did not fade. His legends spread farther than his armies ever had. Stories grew wild that he had never died, that he was watching from exile, that his shadow could still be seen on foggy nights by the field of posts. Parents warned children that Rurik listens. Rebels in other lands invoked his name as both curse and charm, and artists strangely couldn't stop painting him. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of tyranny, yes, but also of absolute power, unshaken resolve, and a terrifying kind of justice. Whether he ruled well or ruled wickedly is a matter of opinion. But one fact remains, no one ever forgot him. The shadow cast by Rurik was long, but it was far from the only one darkening the Middle Ages. In fact, if you thought one man's iron-fisted rule was enough to keep medieval life tense, allow me to introduce an entire phenomenon fueled by righteousness, ambition, and really bad travel decisions: the Crusades. It began in 1095, centuries before Rurik's time, when Pope Urban II called for a grand expedition. The mission? Reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The sales pitch? Do it for God, glory, and possibly some real estate on the side. Across Europe, nobles, knights, mercenaries, and even enthusiastic peasants heard the call and packed their bags. And by bags, I mean crude sacks containing dried meat, iron helmets, and wildly inaccurate maps. What followed was less a spiritual pilgrimage and more a heavily armed road trip, fueled by zeal, hunger, and questionable logistics. The First Crusade was the most successful in that it actually reached Jerusalem. In 1099, after a long and brutal siege, the Crusaders breached the city's walls. What happened next would echo through history, not for its strategy, but for its sheer devastation. Men, women, children, no one was spared. The streets, according to chroniclers, were choked with bodies. Sacred sites became battlegrounds. Homes became barricades. Even the most hardened knights reportedly paused at the scale of destruction, unsure whether they were still on a mission from God or something far less holy. Afterward, the Crusaders didn't hold a moment of silence. They looted, they celebrated, they repurposed temples and markets and declared the mission accomplished. For now. But the violence didn't stay contained to the Holy Land. It had a way of following people home. Inspired by the fervor, smaller mobs throughout Europe turned their eyes toward another enemy: Jewish communities. The logic, if one can call it that, was simple and cruel. If fighting non-Christians abroad was noble, then surely cleansing your own streets was too. This idea manifested in what we now call the Rhineland massacres of 1096. Crusading groups swept through towns in modern-day Germany, confronting Jewish families with offers that weren't really offers. Convert or die. Entire communities vanished. Homes were burned. Synagogues were desecrated, and all of it done with the conviction that it was righteous. None of these were acts of strategy. They were expressions of fear, control, and a dangerous sense of divine permission. And the church? Well, some voices condemned it, others looked away. The result was a period where faith, once meant to offer peace, became a banner under which chaos thrived. If that sounds like it couldn't get any worse, let's move south to 13th century France. Here, a group called the Cathars had formed, a Christian sect with unorthodox beliefs. They rejected many of the church's teachings. They lived simply. They believed that the material world was corrupt, and for this, they were declared heretics. What followed was the Albigensian Crusade. For over 2 decades, an army sanctioned by the Catholic Church moved through southern France. Their goal wasn't to convert, it was to erase. Whole villages were razed, families disappeared, and in one especially grim episode, the sack of Béziers in 1209, when a crusader asked how to tell the Cathars from the Catholics, a papal legate reportedly answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." That wasn't hyperbole, that was policy. This wasn't war in the traditional sense. It wasn't about borders or taxes, it was about control of thought. The message was clear. Belief would be unified or eliminated. But for the ordinary person, caught in the middle of these grand declarations and marching boots, life was never grand. It was terrifying. Imagine waking up in a town where the streets are empty, not because everyone's asleep, but because they've either fled or fallen. Imagine hearing the sound of hooves, not from a merchant, but from men in armor who believe their orders come directly from heaven. For the people living in these regions, the wars of religion weren't a matter of philosophy. They were a matter of survival. Whether you prayed facing east or west didn't matter when your roof was on fire. These stories, while horrific, were not isolated. They reflected a pattern. When power wraps itself in the cloak of faith, it becomes harder to question and easier to fear. And it wasn't just the church or the state that used these tools. Local lords, petty kings, ambitious generals, they all took notes. Whether it was a throne, a town, or a title, people learned quickly that certainty, especially the loud, violent kind, was a currency of its own. By the end of the medieval period, the idea of righteousness had been used to justify nearly every cruelty imaginable. And for many, the age-old question wasn't what is right, but rather who is speaking loudest. So yes, while Rurik ruled with dread and sharp policy, he was far from alone. He was part of a broader era that believed in the power of fear and in the silence it brought. Let's pause here. When you're ready to continue, just say the word, because what comes next, it doesn't get gentler, only stranger. Let's shift the lens now, not to rulers or armies, but to those who stood quietly beneath them, the peasants, the laborers, the countless people who didn't wear crowns or carry swords, but still bore the full weight of the medieval world. For them, life was rarely about politics or crusades. It was about surviving to the next sunrise. And in this chapter, we're focusing on one of the darkest corners of that reality: the public punishments, the tortures, the executions. Because in a society where law and literacy were luxuries, control didn't come from parchment. It came from fear. And the way fear was delivered, often publicly, often creatively, always unforgettable. Let's start with the fire. One of the most well-known and widely used punishments was burning at the stake. Not reserved just for witches, as popular lore might suggest, but for anyone deemed a heretic, a traitor, or someone simply too dangerous to be left standing. The process was methodical. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post. Surrounding them, kindling, branches, straw, anything that burned quickly and fiercely. Crowds would gather, not because they enjoyed the spectacle, though some probably did, but because this was how you learned the rules. A bell might toll, a priest might speak, but eventually the flames always started. Slowly at first, curling upward. There was no swift end. It wasn't meant to be. Now, if that sounds horrific, and it was, consider this. It was just one of several popular options. Another favorite? The breaking wheel. Picture a large wooden wheel laid flat. The condemned person was tied to it, limbs outstretched. Then came the iron bars. With each strike, bones shattered, arms, legs, ribs systematically crushed. The pain wasn't immediate death. The wheel was designed to keep you alive, broken, exposed. Sometimes, executioners would thread the mangled limbs through the spokes, weaving the body into the wheel like a grotesque tapestry. Why? To display, to warn. The wheel might then be hoisted onto a post, left in the sun in the rain for days. Birds would circle, people would pass by, and the lesson would hang there, visible to all. Break the law and the law breaks you. And then there was England. Known for its own brand of theatrical justice, England had a punishment specifically reserved for traitors, something so elaborate it read like a twisted performance script. It was called hanging, drawing, and quartering. First, the accused was hanged, but not long enough to die, just long enough to weaken, to disorient. Then came the drawing, being dragged through the streets, tied behind a horse from the prison to the site of execution. It wasn't far, but it felt eternal. And finally, the quartering. The body was disemboweled, organs burned in front of them if consciousness allowed. Then the body was cut into 4 parts, each limb sent to different corners of the kingdom, displayed on spikes. A warning in 4 directions. It was justice by geography. For the crowd, these events were more than punishments. They were instruction. Parents brought children. Vendors sold snacks. The boundary between ritual and routine blurred. And in some strange, unsettling way, these public deaths reminded people they were still alive. But it wasn't all grand punishments. Sometimes smaller infractions brought their own horrors. Petty theft, branding. The hot iron pressed to flesh, not just to punish, but to mark. A permanent badge of disgrace. No need for a trial next time. Just check the scars. Lying under oath, your tongue might not be needed anymore. Adultery depends where you were. In some places, a fine. In others, a public whipping. In others, still, let's just say walking became difficult. The tools of the trade were many. The pillory, those wooden boards with holes for your head and hands, made you both prisoner and public spectacle. People were encouraged to throw things. Rotten vegetables if they were kind, stones if they weren't. The stocks, similar concept, but for the feet. Great for humiliation, less so for blood circulation. The scold's bridle, a metal cage placed over the head, sometimes with a spike that pressed against the tongue, was used for those deemed too outspoken, usually women. Silence, enforced. And here's the thing, none of these devices were secret. They were displayed, proudly. Every town had a square. Every square had a platform. Justice wasn't whispered. It was announced with a drum roll, because in a world without Twitter, without cameras, without any real legal system to speak of, this was how messages were sent. Do not steal. Do not betray. Do not speak too loudly, or you will become the message. It's easy from a modern perspective to see these punishments as barbaric, and they were. But in the eyes of the time, they were tools, crude, cruel, but understood. In a society constantly on the edge of famine, war, or disease, fear became its own form of structure, and so the platforms remained, the crowds returned, the lessons were taught, again and again. Let's rest here for tonight. But remember, when justice comes without mercy, it's not justice. It's just survival dressed in ceremony. By now, you've met the kings and crusaders, you've seen the torches and the wheels, but let's step even further back to those who didn't make laws, didn't fight in wars, and certainly didn't attend royal banquets. The ordinary people. The ones who woke up every day not wondering how to conquer, but how to stay alive. Because life in the Middle Ages wasn't just dangerous in times of war. It was dangerous every single day. Imagine starting your morning on a straw-stuffed mattress that hasn't been changed in years. In a one-room house you share with your spouse, your children, your chickens, and probably a few insects with long-term leases. There's no chimney, no insulation, and when it rains, which it often does, you're never quite sure if that drop on your face came from the roof or something crawling overhead. Breakfast? If you're lucky, a scoop of cold pottage, a lumpy stew made from old grains, root vegetables, and whatever else hadn't gone bad yet. It had no flavor, but flavor wasn't the point. Survival was. And the water? Untreated, unfiltered, shared by livestock, neighbors, and whatever upstream disaster occurred the night before. So instead you drink weak ale. Yes, beer for breakfast. Even children drank it. Not because it tasted good, but because the boiling process at least killed a few of the invisible horrors hiding inside. Teeth? Not great. Toothbrushes weren't a thing. If you were feeling fancy, you might chew on a stick. Dental pain wasn't a nuisance. It was a potential death sentence. An infected molar could spiral into something far worse and fast. Clothes? You had one outfit, maybe two if you were rich. They were made of rough wool or linen, stiff, scratchy, and frequently unwashed. Laundry day wasn't a concept. Washing your clothes meant hauling water, boiling it over a fire, scrubbing with ashes, and hoping the fabric didn't fall apart, which it often did. Shoes? Optional. And when they did exist, they were flimsy leather sacks tied with hope. They didn't keep out water, cold, or sharp stones. They were there mostly to say, I tried. Work? Constant. Relentless. Whether in the fields or at home, your body was in motion from dawn to dusk. And even then, there was more to do. Mending, thatching, hauling, burying. Illness everywhere. Disease didn't discriminate, but treatment did. No hospitals, no antibiotics. If you fell ill, your options included herbal poultices, whispered prayers, and occasionally the local healer, who might balance your humors by applying leeches to your face. Infection was a lottery, and the prize was usually more infection. Life expectancy? Around 30. Not because people just dropped dead at that age, but because so many didn't survive infancy, childhood, or childbirth. If you made it past 40, people started treating you like a walking miracle, or at least a suspiciously healthy anomaly. And let's not forget the seasons. Winter was brutal. Homes weren't built for warmth, they were built from mud, sticks, and faith. Cold seeped in from every wall, through every floorboard. The hearth, your one source of heat, smoked more than it burned. And if the fire died in the night, you might wake up frozen, if you woke up at all. Summer brought heat, insects, rot. With no refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, and spoiled food brought illness. Baths were rare, body odor was constant. People carried pomanders, small balls of herbs, not to smell nice, but to mask everything else. And then there were the smells. Imagine living in a town without sewers, without garbage removal, without any system of hygiene at all. Waste was dumped in streets, chamber pots emptied out windows, people shouted "Gardaloo" as a warning. It didn't help. The air wasn't just heavy, it was hostile. And yet, people lived. They endured, they loved, they celebrated when they could. A wedding, a harvest, a feast day. Moments of joy broke through the fog of suffering, laughter echoed through muddy streets, songs were sung, bread was shared. Even in a world so often cruel, humanity held on. Because that's what people do. They build fires in the cold, they pass stories through generations. They dream about something better, even if they never see it. So when we look back at the Middle Ages, it's easy to focus on the kings and crusades, the wars and the tortures, but don't forget the quiet heroes, the ones who simply kept going, every day, no matter what. Let's stop here tonight. We've talked about the peasants, the pain, the punishments, but even in a world as unforgiving as the Middle Ages, there were places people could go to escape, at least for a little while, places that smelled like smoke, echoed with laughter, and made you forget the cold dirt floors waiting at home. Tonight, we open the creaking door to one of the most infamous institutions in medieval life, the tavern. Now, don't let your modern expectations fool you. This isn't a cozy pub with artisan ale and reclaimed wood furniture. There's no chalkboard menu or friendly bartender with a waxed mustache. This is a wooden building leaning slightly to one side as if unsure it wants to stay upright. The windows, if there are any, are covered with greasy cloth or animal hide. The sign hanging above the door might feature a mug, a bear, or something in between, but it's mostly faded into suggestion. You walk inside. The first thing that hits you isn't the warmth, it's the smell. Ale, sweat, wet straw, mystery meat, and something unidentifiable that makes you wish it stayed that way. The floor, dirt. The tables, crooked. The benches, shared. You don't get a booth to yourself. You get half a plank of wood next to someone who may or may not be conscious. Candles flicker low in iron sconces, casting just enough light to reveal how filthy everything is, but not quite enough to help you identify the substance stuck to your seat. And yet, it's alive. People shout, they laugh, they argue about livestock. Someone in the corner sings a song about a goose with suspiciously suggestive lyrics. Coins clatter, mugs slam, a dog limps through like it owns the place. You've arrived. The tavern was more than a place to drink. It was the medieval town hall, the rumor mill, the entertainment venue, and the occasional crime scene. Deals were made here, fights were started here, and on very rare, very lucky occasions, friendships were forged here. The drinks, mostly ale. Strong, weak, warm, flat, sometimes all of the above. Wine, if available, was usually sour unless imported. Spirits weren't common yet, but fermented everything was. The food? Questionable. Usually a stew that had been cooking for days, with new ingredients added each morning and very few removed. Bread so hard it could serve as currency or weapon. Cheese, if served, was aged in the sense that no one remembered when it had been made. Meat? Let's just say it's better not to ask. Service was democratic. You shouted, you waved, you hoped. If you were lucky, the tavern keeper noticed. If not, you waited until someone else got thrown out and slid into their spot. Speaking of the tavern keeper, they were the true ruler of this realm. If it was a man, he likely looked like he'd been carved from a barrel and smoked over a peat fire. If it was a woman, and it often was, she could silence a room with a glance sharper than any blade. She knew who owed what, who was lying, and who was trying to sneak out the back with the good ladle. She didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Her memory was terrifying. The tavern keeper was chef, referee, banker, bouncer, and, when necessary, judge. And then there was the entertainment. Sometimes a bard with a lute, sometimes a juggler missing 3 fingers, occasionally just a man telling a joke badly until someone told him to stop with a tankard. Music wasn't performed, it erupted. It spilled out of mouths half full of drink and stories half remembered. Dances broke out, arguments too, occasionally at the same time. And yet, despite the noise, the grime, the unpredictability, people came, because the tavern was warmth in winter. Noise and silence, chaos in a world where everything else was ordered by force. Here, a peasant could drink next to a soldier. A thief might buy a round for a monk. Hierarchies blurred. For a moment, everyone was just someone trying to forget how hard life could be. Upstairs, if the building had a second floor, were the rooms. Calling them rooms was generous. They were closets with straw mattresses, drafty, dark, and shared if demand was high. Privacy wasn't expected. Clean sheets were a fantasy, and if you found a bedbug, you named it and accepted your fate. Still, it was a roof, a night off the wet ground, a place to pretend, if only briefly, that life could be a little softer. And maybe that's why the tavern endured. It didn't offer comfort, but it offered release, a break from the rules, a chance to laugh too loud, drink too much, and sing too poorly. In a world where kings built towers of stone and peasants built fires out of fear, the tavern built nothing, but it held everything together. Let's turn our attention now to a group rarely mentioned in heroic ballads, but absolutely essential to medieval life: the workers. Not the noble artisans crafting stained glass windows for cathedrals, not the court scribes transcribing decrees with flourishes and feather quills. No, we're talking about the ones who hauled, hammered, stitched, scrubbed and sweated every single day, because behind every castle, church, and cobblestone road was a laborer who didn't ask for glory, just enough coin to eat, and maybe, just maybe, a roof that didn't leak on their face. Take the stone mason. Their hands were calloused, their backs permanently bent. They didn't build castles for glory. They built them because someone shouted, "Build," and not doing so meant hunger or punishment. They lifted stones heavier than dreams and carved them with tools barely sharper than their own teeth. And if they were lucky, the wall didn't collapse before payday. Weavers spent entire days at the loom, eyes red from the dust, fingers bleeding from threads so rough it could cut through dignity. Their reward? A few coins and a new layer of lint permanently embedded in their lungs. Blacksmiths lived in fire, literally. Their homes doubled as forges. Their lungs were lined with soot. Their skin smelled like iron and sweat and the occasional accidental eyebrow singe. They worked until the hammer felt lighter than the bread they could afford. And tailors? No machines, no patterns, just guesswork, sore fingers, and clients who always wanted a little tighter without realizing that linen doesn't listen. But perhaps the most relentless work of all wasn't done by tradesmen. It was done by women. Medieval women didn't clock out. They didn't finish their shift. They were the shift. They rose before dawn, kindled the fire, ground the grain, fetched the water, prepared the meals, mended the clothes, scrubbed the floors, tended the animals, calmed the children, cared for the sick, and then did it all again the next day. And the next. And the next. All without pause, without complaint, and without recognition. And if a woman happened to be unmarried and of working age, she might end up in a noble's household, a servant, a scullery maid, a laundress, her job everything. And the thanks she got? Usually a bruise or a prayer. But even that was safer than childbirth, because medieval medicine, as we've discussed, wasn't exactly ahead of its time. Giving birth meant lying on a straw mat, gripping a wooden beam, and hoping that the local midwife had at least heard of hygiene. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, just screaming and prayer. Many women didn't survive. Many children didn't either. And still, they kept going because that's what life required. And let's not forget the children. Childhood wasn't a protected bubble. It was a countdown. By the age of 7 or 8, you were expected to help. In the fields, in the workshop, in the kitchen. There were no teenage years. You went from toddler to tiny laborer overnight. And education? Rare, reserved. If you were taught to read, it was likely for religious texts. If you were taught to write, someone probably expected you to account for taxes. But somehow, through the cold, the work, the weight of centuries, people carved out moments. They danced. On feast days, in courtyards, in muddy fields, beneath banners strung up with more hope than craftsmanship. Music played. Pipes, drums, fiddles, and feet moved. Laughter wasn't rare. It was a rebellion, a refusal to surrender to the grimness of daily life. Even the poorest found ways to mark time, a wedding, a harvest, a saint's day. Bread might be plain, but it was broken together. Clothes might be tattered, but they were mended with care. They sang old songs, told older stories, and somehow, through it all, passed those stories down. Because while kings wrote history, these people lived it. Their names might not survive in dusty tomes, their deeds might not echo through vaulted halls, but without them, the medieval world would have collapsed faster than a thatched roof in a thunderstorm. They didn't need statues, they needed shoes. And yet, they endured. Let's rest here for now. We've spent time with the workers, the weavers, the wanderers, but now let's turn our gaze upward, toward the towers, toward the halls draped in banners, toward the people who didn't wake up to shovel mud, but to sip watered wine in drafty rooms and wonder how best to look important. Yes, we're talking about the nobility. But before you start picturing luxury, silk pillows, or golden chalices filled with pomegranate juice, let me stop you right there. Because being rich in the Middle Ages, still pretty awful. Let's begin with the castle, impressive from the outside. Huge stone walls, tall towers, a drawbridge that says, "Go away, peasants." But inside, cold, dark, and draftier than a barn door in a hurricane. The floors, stone. The ceilings, leaky. The heating, non-existent. If you wanted warmth, you needed a fire, and not a cute fireplace. We're talking open hearths that filled entire rooms with smoke, and still somehow managed to leave your toes frozen. The tapestries on the walls, not just for decoration, they were insulation. Basically medieval wallpaper made of heavy cloth and desperate hope. Now about hygiene. You might think the nobles were cleaner than the peasants, and technically they were, but only because they had servants to smell things for them. Bathing? Maybe once a month, maybe. More if they were French. Less if they thought water weakened the body, which oddly, many did. Instead, they powdered themselves. They wore perfumed gloves. They changed shirts more often than they washed skin. And if things got really dire, they just moved to another room and pretended nothing happened. Toilets? Ah yes, the famed garderobe. A hole in the wall that dropped waste directly into the moat or pit below. No seat, no privacy, just wind, stone, and the sound of your dignity leaving your body. You think public restrooms are bad? Try doing your business above an open shaft while a winter draft whistles up your cloak. Fashion? Painful. Noblemen wore tunics so tight they had to be sewn into them. Noble women wore dresses with sleeves so long they could clean the floor just by walking. Shoes were pointy to the point of comedy, sometimes so extended that chains had to be attached to the knees to keep people from tripping. Looking good meant suffering. Meals? Grand, yes, but odd. Lots of meat. Heavy stews. Game birds stuffed with smaller birds stuffed with spices no one could pronounce. Forks? Rare. You ate with a knife in your fingers. Napkins? Your sleeve. Entertainment? Jesters, minstrels, and sometimes each other. If a noble got bored, he might host a mock trial, or a feast where everything had to be eaten backwards, or a party-themed how many colors can I wear at once. It was all very extravagant and very exhausting. Now let's talk politics, because being noble wasn't just about lounging around on cushions. It was about alliances, feuds, backstabbing, sometimes literal. You weren't just born into power, you had to keep it. Through marriages you didn't choose, friendships you didn't trust, and family members you definitely shouldn't have turned your back on. Every noble court was a nest of whispers. Who's inheriting what? Who insulted whom? Who's secretly working with the enemy? A single rumor could start a war or end a marriage, or both. And war? Constant. Being noble meant land. Land meant soldiers. Soldiers meant obligations. When your king called, you had to ride, not because you wanted to, but because honor demanded it. And also because not showing up might mean losing your lands, or your head. So off they went, armored, noble, and often completely unprepared. Some died in battle, some died of dysentery before the first sword was drawn, and some just disappeared. Because even with all their privilege, all their wealth, all their titles, nobles were just as vulnerable as anyone else, to disease, to betrayal, to the shifting winds of power. Their castles might have had walls, but they weren't safe. Their wealth bought them comfort, but not peace. Their names lived on, etched into tombs and scrolls, but so did their mistakes. So next time you see a painting of a stern-looking noble in a ruffled collar and brocade cloak, remember, he probably hadn't bathed in weeks, was terrified of his cousin, and spent half his life wondering if the goose he just ate had been cursed. Let's stop here for now. Now that we've wandered through castles, kitchens, and taverns, let's step into the one place where hope and fear walked hand in hand, the church. Because in the Middle Ages, if you were alive, you were religious. Not always by choice, but by structure. Faith wasn't a personal journey, it was a public requirement. It shaped laws, education, punishment, and even how you slept. Yes, really. Let's begin with the building itself. The church was the center of town, not metaphorically, literally. It was often the tallest structure, the first thing built, and the last thing anyone questioned. Its bell didn't just tell time. It told you when to wake up, when to pray, when to work, and when someone had died. Inside, stone walls, high ceilings, flickering candles, and the faint scent of incense mixed with unwashed humanity. The air was thick, sacred, and a little sour. Sermons were delivered in Latin, which, spoiler alert, almost no one understood. But that wasn't the point. You weren't there to comprehend, you were there to obey. The church held power more than kings in some regions. It could bless, it could curse, it could declare your marriage void or your soul condemned. Salvation wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Tithes were required, confession was encouraged, and fear? That was always included in the sermon. Because if there's one thing the church mastered in the medieval era, it was the art of keeping people terrified of the afterlife. Heaven sounded lovely, but the real marketing tool was hell. Hell was detailed, specific, graphic. Fire, chains, screaming, creatures with too many teeth and not enough mercy. Books described punishments for every sin. Gluttons force-fed molten lead, liars with their tongues torn out, and the proud, bent backwards under the weight of their own arrogance. These weren't vague warnings. They were illustrated, in full color, on walls, in manuscripts, on woodcuts that made bedtime stories impossible. And demons? They were everywhere. People believed they lurked in forests, under beds, behind poorly behaved goats. If your child was sick, it might be demonic possession. If your crops failed, clearly the devil had walked through your barley. If you sneezed 3 times in a row, someone probably started boiling holy water. But here's the twist. The church didn't just warn you, it offered protection. Holy relics, sacred prayers, pilgrimages, pilgrimage badges, pilgrimage socks. If you could walk, kneel, or crawl to a shrine, you had a chance. And people did walk, for miles, across borders, across mountain ranges, sometimes barefoot, sometimes sick, sometimes nearly dead. All in the hope that touching a bone wrapped in gold might make their suffering stop. And what about saints? They weren't just figures of virtue, they were your hotline to the divine. Each one had a specialty. Lost your keys? Pray to Saint Zita. Fear storms? That's Saint Medard. Trouble with rats? Saint Gertrude. Believe it or not. Your faith became a sort of medieval customer service, with saints as your case managers and relics as the hold music. But despite all this ritual and reassurance, people remained afraid. Afraid of damnation, of demons, of doing the wrong thing the wrong way at the wrong time in front of the wrong priest. Because the rules were many, and forgiveness, while available, often came with a price, sometimes literal. Yes, the church sold indulgences, a fee, a transaction, a way to shave time off your stay in purgatory, the medieval version of a bureaucratic waiting room for souls. It was complicated, controversial, and incredibly popular, especially among those with wealth to spare. But what about those without wealth? They relied on fear. Fear to stay in line, fear to explain misfortune, fear to accept suffering, and fear to hope. Because if things were bad now, surely that meant heaven would be better, right? That's what they were told. That's what they believed. And so they carried on. They rang the bells, crossed themselves before meals, whispered prayers before bed. Hoped their sins were small and their saints were listening. And when death came, as it often did, it was not quiet. It came with a priest, a final confession, a blessing, a candle, a promise, and then darkness. Let's pause here. If fear was the engine of the Middle Ages, then death was the ever-present passenger. But not just any death. We're talking about the kind that arrives without warning, without mercy, and often without logic. Tonight, we speak of the Black Death. It started quietly, a cough, a fever, a village here, a ship there. But within months, it became something else entirely. A sweeping, choking, unrelenting tide of suffering that erased entire communities in the time it took to sharpen a scythe. The year was 1347. Europe was already fragile, wars, famines, unrest. But when the plague arrived, carried by fleas hiding on rats, hiding on ships, it didn't care about your crown, your coin, or your prayers. It just wanted your lungs. The symptoms were unmistakable. Sudden chills, swollen lymph nodes, huge, black, and grotesque. Buboes, they were called. Boils the size of eggs, filled with infection, pulsing under the skin like angry fruit. Fever followed, then vomiting, then death. Sometimes in a week, sometimes in a day, sometimes in hours. It spared no one. Peasants, nobles, priests, children. The healthy ran, the infected died, and the terrified did both. Cities fell silent. Markets emptied, churches filled with corpses. The bells tolled not for ceremony, but because there was no time to carve names into stone. And those who survived? They didn't always feel lucky. They watched neighbors collapse in the street, entire families vanish, towns go dark. People began to question everything. Was it punishment? Was it the devil? Was it something in the air, the stars, the soup? No one knew. Doctors, such as they were, did their best, which wasn't much. The iconic plague doctor outfit, long cloak, beaked mask filled with herbs, wasn't a sign of knowledge. It was a costume of hope. The beak, thought to filter bad air. The stick used to prod the dying from a distance. They couldn't cure, they could barely help, but at least they looked like they were trying. And the treatments? Leeches, bloodletting, burning aromatic herbs, bathing in vinegar, flogging oneself in the streets, hoping God would take pity. Some turned to faith, others turned on their neighbors. Rumors spread faster than the plague, that Jews had poisoned wells, that witches had summoned it, that foreigners carried death on their clothes. Panic turned to violence. In some cities, Jewish communities were rounded up and slaughtered, accused without evidence, burned alive, driven out. Because when people are afraid, they don't look for facts, they look for someone to blame. And still the plague spread. It swept through Italy, France, England, the Holy Roman Empire. It reached Iceland, it touched Russia, it killed tens of millions. 1/3 of Europe, gone. Imagine that. Every third person you know vanished. Every third house abandoned. Every third hope extinguished. And yet somehow life continued. Gravediggers became the most essential workers. Monks copied the names of the dead until their ink ran dry. Survivors married fast, inherited faster, and prayed hardest of all. Art changed. The dance of death became a common motif. Skeletons leading kings and commoners alike in a macabre waltz. Because death didn't discriminate, and neither did the plague. But here's what's strange. After the Black Death, Europe changed. Labor became scarce, workers demanded wages, feudal bonds began to break. Social mobility, once frozen in place, suddenly thawed. Entire estates went to unexpected heirs. Some peasants became landowners, some women became heads of households. It was horror, but also upheaval. It cracked the walls of tradition, and slowly, painfully, a new world began to form. Not better, but different. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it killed certainty. It left behind a population forever altered, a culture obsessed with death, a church forced to explain the unexplainable, and a continent with fewer people but many more questions. It was the end of something and the beginning of everything else. Let's pause here. The plague had passed, or at least receded, like a storm that didn't vanish but simply moved farther down the coastline. The bells rang less, the carts of the dead rolled by more quietly. The air still held the memory of smoke and loss, but beneath it, something else stirred. Change. Because as the ashes of the Black Death settled, something unexpected happened. Europe began to breathe, not evenly, not joyfully, but differently. For centuries, life had been dictated by tradition, by status, by superstition. But now, entire systems had cracked. Villages were empty, land went unclaimed, and for the first time, people who once served began asking, "What if I didn't?" The lords needed workers, and workers knew it. Peasants, once bound to land and lord, began negotiating, demanding wages, refusing to return. In England, laws were passed to force them back, like the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349. But good luck enforcing that when half your enforcers were either dead or terrified. This wasn't a revolution. Not yet, but it was leverage. And in a world built on hierarchy, even a sliver of leverage was radical. In the cities, guilds grew stronger. Artisans organized, merchants took bigger risks. With fewer mouths to feed, there was more food to go around. Diets improved, life expectancy ticked upward, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And with survival came curiosity. Books began to circulate, not just among monks, but among scholars, nobles, even wealthy merchants. Latin wasn't the only language being written anymore. People started writing in French, in Italian, in English. Stories weren't just about saints and sin. They were about love, adventure, politics, pain, and they were being copied faster than ever. thanks to the arrival of something that would break history wide open: the printing press. Invented around 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg, the press took what once took months, hand copying a single book, and made it possible in days. The first major printed work? The Bible, of course, but that was just the beginning. Pamphlets, poems, political arguments. Suddenly, ideas traveled faster than horses. Knowledge began to spread, not just upward, but outward. This terrified some, delighted others, and changed everyone. Education expanded, slowly, yes, but where once reading was rare, it now became aspirational. Universities blossomed, libraries grew, and while literacy still belonged mostly to the privileged, it was no longer chained to a monastery wall. And art? Oh, art exploded. In Florence, Venice, Bruges, artists began painting not just saints and martyrs, but people, real people, with shadows, expressions, flaws. Perspective entered the canvas. Human emotion returned to stone. Beauty wasn't just divine, it was human. This was the birth of something new, something that hadn't yet been named, but would soon be called the Renaissance. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're still in the transition, still halfway between darkness and dawn. The torches of the old world hadn't gone out, but new flames were being lit. In workshops, in universities, in quiet rooms where someone asked, "What if the stars don't move around us?" Science, too, began stirring, not loudly, not yet, but with questions. Why do objects fall? How does the body work? What's beyond the visible sky? And slowly medicine crept forward. Physicians began washing hands, studying anatomy, challenging the humors that had ruled diagnosis for centuries. Leeches were still popular, but at least someone started asking, wait, why? Trade resumed and grew. With the fall of feudal barriers, cities became hubs. Ships sailed farther. Silk, spices, and stories arrived from distant lands. With them came new math, new maps, and unsettling new truths. The earth wasn't flat, the stars weren't fixed, the church didn't have all the answers, and yet faith persisted. It just shifted. Where once every cathedral claimed absolute authority, cracks appeared. Debates began. Some whispered, some shouted. A monk in Germany would soon hammer a list of complaints to a door. But that's a story for later. For now, understand this. The Middle Ages weren't just fading, they were evolving. Not evenly, not gently, but undeniably. Some regions clung to the past, others sprinted toward the future. And in between were people, ordinary, tired, curious people, living through history without knowing it. They still feared disease, still buried loved ones, still worked fields and fetched water and hoped the winter wouldn't be too cruel. But they also dreamed of a life beyond survival, of a world beyond their village, of thoughts beyond the ones allowed. And once people start dreaming, it's hard to stop them. So yes, the Black Death was a horror, but it was also a spark, not because it made life better, but because it made life questionable. It broke the illusion of permanence. And when the dust settled, the survivors didn't just rebuild, they reimagined. Let's pause here. By now, the dust of the plague had mostly settled. Fields were growing again. Taverns buzzed with life. Scribes copied faster. Merchants sailed farther. And deep beneath the polished words and fresher bread, something seismic was stirring, not in the ground, but in the mind. Ideas. It began with whispers. A monk in a candlelit study, a merchant reading between shipments, a student flipping through Aristotle by accident and asking, wait, what if we're wrong? And that, right there, was the threat. Because for centuries, power had rested comfortably on a single truth. We know best. Kings knew best. Priests knew best. The church knew best. Your job was to obey, not to ask questions, but now questions were blooming like mold in a medieval cellar. Why do some people get richer while others suffer? Why does the church sell forgiveness? Why can't we read the Bible ourselves? Why does the sky not move the way we were told? These weren't just abstract musings. They were dynamite, because as we said last time, the printing press had changed everything, and with every page pressed, an old certainty lost traction. Enter the heretics, not the wild-eyed rebels of fantasy, not fire-breathing revolutionaries. No, just people with books, pens, and questions. In Bohemia, Jan Hus preached in the local tongue. He challenged church corruption, called for reform, and dared suggest that faith didn't require Latin. For this, he was invited to speak, then promptly arrested and burned. Lesson noted. But the fire didn't kill the question. It scattered the embers. Soon, those embers reached Germany, where a young monk named Martin Luther had a hammer, 95 problems, and a church door. He didn't mean to shatter the world. But when he questioned indulgences, those little paper promises that said, skip purgatory for a price, he tapped into centuries of frustration. His arguments weren't just printed, they were multiplied, carried by merchants, tucked into cloaks, read aloud in taverns. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion, and for once, they didn't need a priest's permission to have it. The Reformation had begun, and the church, it was not pleased. It fought back, with councils, excommunications, and the sharp edge of old habits. But something had shifted. Control was no longer absolute. Kings noticed, queens noticed, peasants noticed. The idea that power could be questioned had been proven, and with religious upheaval came political cracks. The divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs ruled because God wanted them to, began to feel shaky, not gone, not yet. But now when a crown weighed heavy on someone's head, they couldn't be sure whether it was heaven's hand or history's habit. Rebellions flared, peasant uprisings, urban riots, some fueled by hunger, others by hope, all fueled by the same whisper. What if things could be different? And the ruling class, once confident in their stone walls and thick tapestries, began to sweat. Because control is a delicate thing. You can command a sword, you can bribe a noble, but you cannot silence a rumor, not forever. And when enough people start repeating that rumor, it becomes revolution. Universities became battlegrounds of thought, cities became testing grounds for policy, and everywhere, the old world tried desperately to pretend it hadn't already ended. In art, the shift was obvious. Painters depicted common people, not just saints. Writers mocked kings, questioned tradition, and snuck satire into every line. The theater became a mirror, and sometimes what it reflected made those in power very uncomfortable. In England, a man named William Shakespeare turned noble tragedy into a human farce. In France, Montaigne asked whether we really knew anything at all. Across Europe, intellectuals began to write in their own voices, their own languages, their own truths. And through it all, the printing presses kept turning, churning out books, treatises, Bibles in German, pamphlets in Dutch, plays in English, scandalous letters in Italian. The written word became the true monarch of Europe, uncrowned, unkillable, and wildly contagious. Even as church and crown tightened their grip, the ideas slipped through like smoke. And the people? They didn't rise all at once, not yet, but they were watching, they were reading, and most dangerously, they were remembering. Let's pause here. The old world was shaking. But like any great fortress, it wouldn't collapse quietly. Because as the Reformation spread and whispers turned into declarations, another battlefront was forming. One not of religion or royalty, but of reason. This was the dawn of science. But make no mistake, it did not arrive on a golden chariot. It crept in through back doors, it flickered in candlelight, it was scribbled in notebooks that might get you killed if discovered. Because questioning the heavens wasn't just rebellious, it was heresy. And yet, they questioned. Let's start with Copernicus, a quiet man, a canon, not a revolutionary. He spent years calculating, drawing, revising, and what he proposed was simple, terrifying, and completely correct. The Earth wasn't the center of the universe, the sun was. This idea, heliocentrism, wasn't entirely new. The ancient Greeks had whispered it long ago, but now it had math, it had models, it had evidence. And that was the problem, because if the Earth wasn't the center, what else might not be? Copernicus delayed publishing until the end of his life. Smart move, because when the idea spread, it didn't cause applause, it caused panic. The church declared it false, heretical, dangerous. But the idea had already entered the bloodstream of thought, and once there, it refused to leave. Enter Galileo Galilei. Not quiet, not careful, brilliant, loud, and hopelessly addicted to telescopes. He built one strong enough to look at Jupiter and discovered moons orbiting it, which, again, begged the question. If moons orbit Jupiter and we orbit the sun, then maybe, just maybe, the universe isn't what we thought. Galileo wrote. He lectured, he mocked, and then he was summoned. The Inquisition wasn't known for subtlety. They made Galileo recant, publicly, under threat. He agreed, sort of. But as legend has it, after being forced to deny the motion of the earth, he whispered, "I pur se muove," and yet it moves. Truth doesn't die, it just hides and waits. Meanwhile, others joined the fray. Johannes Kepler discovered the laws of planetary motion, proving that orbits weren't perfect circles, but ellipses, a small, inconvenient detail that upset centuries of tidy models. William Harvey figured out blood circulation, overturning 1,000 years of medical guesswork. Francis Bacon gave us the scientific method, because I feel like it wasn't working anymore. And then came Isaac Newton. He didn't just observe apples, he redefined gravity, motion, optics. He wrote in Latin with equations that sang like scripture. He built a framework so elegant it lasted until Einstein casually upended it centuries later. But back then, Newton was untouchable, except by his own paranoia. He believed God had chosen him to decode the universe, and maybe he had, because suddenly the world made sense. Predictable, measurable, testable. And this terrified people, because if the universe worked by laws, what did that mean for miracles? If a falling object could be explained by gravity, not divine will, where did that leave God? This wasn't just science, it was theology with numbers, faith with variables. And so, as science rose, the church doubled down. Books were banned, scientists were watched, ideas were suppressed. But suppression is a terrible long-term strategy, because knowledge once tasted is addictive. Universities became laboratories. Merchants invested in voyages not just for spice, but for specimens. A new breed of thinker emerged, not beholden to crown or cross, but to data. These thinkers didn't believe the earth spun. They proved it. They didn't hope for cures. They tested them. And slowly, ever so slowly, life began to reflect that shift. Maps improved, ships sailed straighter, medicine started saving more lives than it ended. And children, once taught to memorize and obey, were now being asked to observe. Of course, this didn't reach everyone. Villages still feared comets. Superstition still draped over daily life like a damp wool blanket. But something was different. The world wasn't just full of divine mystery, it was full of patterns, of potential, of questions worth asking. And yet, this enlightenment came at a price. For those who challenged the old order, the cost could be exile, silence, or worse. But for the world as a whole, it meant standing at the edge of a new century, not ruled by swords or saints, but by sight. Galileo's telescope, Newton's prism, Harvey's scalpel, Bacon's question. These were the new relics, not of faith, but of understanding. Let's pause here. The world had learned to think, to test, to question. And now, it began to ask a far more dangerous question. What is a human life worth? Not in gold, not in grain, but in rights, in dignity, in choice. Because for centuries, people had been told, you are born into a role, and that role defines you forever. King or peasant, lord or servant, male or female, power flowed downward, like wine at a noble's table. You drank what trickled down, and you were supposed to be grateful. But the Enlightenment said, what if humans weren't just subjects of monarchs or children of churches? What if they were individuals? This was not a quiet realization. It was a philosophical earthquake. Thinkers like John Locke began writing about natural rights, not granted by kings, but by existence itself. Life, liberty, property, not gifts, rights. And if rights were universal, then oppression wasn't just unfortunate, it was immoral. In salons and studies across Europe, conversations changed. Suddenly, people weren't just discussing the best wine. They were debating government, justice, representation, the role of the state, the responsibilities of rulers. Voltaire used wit like a sword. Montesquieu dissected power. Rousseau asked whether society had made man worse, not better. Mary Wollstonecraft argued, radically, that women might also be people. These weren't dusty ideas, they were weapons, dangerous ones. Because once you convince people they deserve freedom, they start demanding it. And the rulers, they noticed. At first, they smiled politely. sponsored a few philosophers, attended a lecture, sipped tea while nodding at words like reason and reform. But reason has sharp edges, and reform, once named, grows teeth. The American colonies picked up those Enlightenment pamphlets and turned them into rebellion. No taxation without representation wasn't just a slogan. It was a thesis, a philosophy wrapped in revolution. And then came France. France, where opulence sat side by side with starvation, where the Palace of Versailles shimmered while children starved, where King Louis XVI thought divine rights still worked, until his people handed him a list of demands and eventually a guillotine. The French Revolution was many things: bloody, chaotic, inspiring, terrifying. But it was also proof. Proof that the Enlightenment wasn't just for bookshelves. It could take to the streets, and when it did, it could topple thrones. Suddenly, across Europe, monarchs clutched their crowns a little tighter. Nobles whispered in fear. Parliaments began writing things down: laws, declarations, constitutions. The idea that rulers serve the people was no longer laughable. It was possible. Of course, this didn't mean paradise. Freedom once unleashed is hard to aim. Revolutions brought hope and horror. Rights were declared and denied. Women marched and were ignored. Colonies cheered liberty, then kept slaves. The Age of Reason didn't solve everything, it just refused to ignore it. And that was the point. Because now people noticed injustice. They named it, described it, challenged it. No longer was poverty God's will. No longer was monarchy natural. No longer was silence safe. This was the Great Awakening. Not of religion, but of responsibility. Newspapers became instruments of dissent. Coffee houses became centers of politics. The middle class, once content with crumbs, now asked, why not a seat at the table? Even science got political. Vaccines appeared. Hospitals improved. Life expectancy rose. But who got access? Who was left behind? Even the microscope couldn't escape the microscope. And as education spread, so did skepticism. People no longer feared books. They feared not having them. The printing press, once used to spread scripture, now printed revolutions. Satire, satires of satire, debates about liberty, philosophical dialogues disguised as plays, poems, and filthy jokes. And while the elite tried to dress the Enlightenment in wigs and waistcoats, the streets were hungry for change. This wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. People felt injustice now, not as a distant reality, but as a daily insult. And once you feel it, you don't forget. The Enlightenment wasn't a moment, it was a movement. A shift in how humans saw themselves and each other. Suddenly, a farmer wasn't just a tool, a servant wasn't just background noise, a woman wasn't just a vessel, a child wasn't just an inheritance. They were human beings, with thoughts, desires, rights. And that realization, that simple radical truth, it couldn't be burned or banned or buried. It could be slowed, betrayed, distorted, but not erased. Let's pause here. The Enlightenment had swung the door open. Light rushed in. Reason, liberty, equality. Philosophers dreamed of better worlds, of societies ruled not by bloodlines but by laws, not by divine will but by consent. A new age of ideas had begun. But open doors don't only let in sunlight, they also let in shadows. Tonight, we talk about greed. Not the kind that makes you swipe a coin off a table when no one's looking. We're talking about the systemic, polished, institutional kind. The kind that smiles with perfect teeth while measuring how many bodies can fit into a cargo hold. Because while people were debating rights and reading treatises, others saw a different kind of potential. Profit. Empires shifted, kings stumbled, merchants stepped forward, and with them came capital. Trade routes multiplied, goods poured in, and somewhere along the way, humans became products. You see, the Enlightenment asked, what is the value of a human being? And the market replied, how strong are his arms? The transatlantic slave trade didn't slow down during the Age of Reason. It accelerated. Ships designed for speed now carried shackled men, women, and children, optimized, insured, tracked on ledgers beside barrels of rum and crates of sugar. And the nations that prided themselves on philosophy, France, Britain, Portugal, Spain, they were building fortunes on backs they refused to call human. They talked about civilization while burning villages. They praised liberty while branding flesh, and they kept very tidy receipts. But slavery was only one gear in a much larger machine. This was also the age of industry, the Industrial Revolution, a time of wonder, of invention, of unstoppable progress. Steam engines roared, textiles flew from looms, coal poured into furnaces, cities exploded skyward and outward, and life became faster than anyone had dreamed possible. But behind the smoke, soot-covered children worked 16-hour shifts. Behind the steel, women earned in a week what a man spent on lunch. Behind the statistics, thousands died anonymously in collapses, in accidents, in air so thick with poison it turned lungs to leather. Progress, it turns out, has a body count. And still, greed smiled. It told you that if you worked hard enough, you could rise. You could become the next Rockefeller, the next Carnegie, the next Titan. All you had to do was not ask too many questions. And when that dream wore thin, when people began to grumble, the powers that be reached for their old tools, laws, chains, and soldiers. Because greed isn't creative, just persistent. It repackages itself. It hides behind good words, words like freedom, like market, like civilizing mission. Ah yes, colonialism. While factories choked Europe, entire continents were being carved up like holiday roasts. Africa, Asia, the Americas. Borders drawn by men who'd never seen the rivers they named. Treaties signed in languages no one on the other side spoke. Whole cultures erased or labeled savage. Entire populations reduced to labor quotas. And this wasn't some chaotic conquest. It was managed, charted, justified with charts and essays and speeches, all in the name of growth. Even science, which had once dared to explain the heavens, was enlisted to rank people. Phrenology, eugenics, pseudosciences designed not to discover truth, but to reinforce power, to explain why some ruled and others served, why some were rich and others deserved poverty. This wasn't ignorance, it was intentional, because knowledge is only as good as the hands it serves. And yet, resistance brewed. Enslaved people rebelled, on ships, on plantations, in the courts of public opinion. Workers organized, strikes, pamphlets, riots, unions. Women wrote, no longer just poems and letters, but manifestos. Colonized nations remembered who they had been before borders. The printing press, once used to spread Bibles, now spread revolution. The railways that carried goods now carried speeches, books, people. And the dream of reason? It wasn't dead. It was just disappointed. Because liberty, it turned out, didn't trickle down. It had to be demanded, fought for, protected. The same Enlightenment thinkers who imagined freedom often refused to grant it beyond their own class or race or gender. But ideas have strange lifespans. They live in places their creators never imagined. They slip into hands that were never meant to hold them. And when they do, change comes. Not clean, not fast, not fair, but inevitable. Let's rest here. Dưới đây là Part 18, tiếp tục trung thành với mạch truyện và phong cách đã thiết lập, một chương kể về hiện đại nhưng với chiếc gương hậu vẫn dính đầy bụi của quá khứ. So here we are, the 21st century, the age of smartphones, smart homes, and smart fridges that know more about your diet than your doctor. We carry libraries in our pockets, satellites orbit above us, streaming cat videos to living rooms once warmed by fire and fear. This is the future, right? And yet, it feels familiar. Because for all our progress, we didn't quite leave the past behind. We brought it with us, in our systems, in our shadows, in the quiet ways we pretend we've evolved while still clinging to the same old fears. Let's start with power. It looks different now. Glossy, global, digitized, CEOs instead of kings, algorithms instead of armies. But the structures remain hauntingly recognizable. A handful control the many. Wealth piled so high it forms its own weather system. Billionaires build rocket ships while millions still search for clean water. It's not a palace anymore, it's a private island, a data vault, a hedge fund no one understands but everyone fears. And the rest? We're still told to be grateful, to hustle, to dream, to bootstrap our way to success on sidewalks cracked by centuries of inequality. Sound familiar? Now, war hasn't vanished, it's just evolved. Drones hum where horses once galloped. Propaganda fits in 280 characters. Civilians still die, still flee, still wake up to skies they no longer trust. But now we watch in real time. We retweet grief, filter it, move on. And the environment? Well, the planet has started charging interest. Centuries of extraction, pollution, and denial have come due. The ice is melting, the oceans rising, forests burning, species vanishing, all while leaders gather in suits to agree on what they already agreed on last year and fail to act again. Meanwhile, history itself becomes a battleground. Facts debated, truth bent, memory monetized. We have more information than ever before and less clarity. Conspiracy becomes currency. Outrage becomes content. And nuance? That's bad for engagement. We're connected, yes, but are we listening? We've learned to scroll, not to sit, to consume, not to contemplate. And in that speed, that relentless swipe forward, we risk forgetting that change is not inevitable, it's earned, that justice isn't trending, it's built, that freedom isn't given, it's defended. So what now? Do we surrender to the noise? Or do we pause? Look back, not with nostalgia, but with honesty, and then forward, not with fear, but with intent, because history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And in this verse, we are the ones writing the next line. Let's rest here, say continue. When you're ready for part 19, teen, the final descent into a world that has always been both beautiful and broken, and what it truly means to learn from the stories we've survived. The 20th century didn't arrive politely. It kicked the door off its hinges, marched in with muddy boots, and threw history into a blender set to chaos. This was supposed to be the future. The age of electricity, motion pictures, airplanes, radios, an era where steam became steel and steel became skyscrapers, where humanity had unlocked the atom, charted the skies, and imagined peace not just as a dream, but a plan. And yet, within just a few decades, the world burned like never before. Let's start with World War I, a war no one wanted, a war that happened anyway, sparked by an assassination, yes, but really born from fear, pride, and empires that had grown too big, too brittle, and too eager to prove themselves. It was supposed to be quick. It wasn't. It became a meat grinder. Trench warfare, barbed wire, mud that swallowed horses and hope alike, machine guns mowing down charging lines like wheat, gas that turned lungs into soup, rats, lice, silence, and then shells, always the shells. They called it the war to end all wars. They were wrong. It ended with treaties and trauma, with maps redrawn by men in suits who had no idea what they were doing, with promises broken and seeds of hatred quietly sown into the soil. And then came the silence between wars. The 1920s, a decade that danced while ignoring the smoke still curling beneath the floorboards. Jazz, champagne. Stock markets rising like helium balloons, everyone smiling, no one blinking. Until 1929. When the crash came, it wasn't just a market, it was belief. In progress, in wealth, in systems. Banks collapsed, families shattered, bread lines formed in cities where gold had once flowed like water. And in the cracks, new voices began to rise. Some called for unity, for compassion, for shared struggle. Others called for blame. Blame the immigrants, blame the poor, blame the other. Wrap the flag tighter. March in unison. Speak only one truth or else. And from this poison, fascism grew. Italy, Germany, Spain. Men with sharp uniforms and sharper tongues promised greatness, promised order, promised to restore what had been lost, even if it meant burning the world to do it. Then came World War II, a war not stumbled into but built, brick by brutal brick. It consumed the globe, nations fell, cities turned to ash, bombs fell not on armies, but on civilians. Entire populations were erased with terrifying precision. The Holocaust, industrialized murder, a genocide that showed the world how horror could be organized into efficiency. Over 70 million dead. The war ended with a new kind of terror, the atomic bomb, a weapon that didn't just kill, it vaporized. It erased cities. It changed the very idea of war. Suddenly, the next fight might not leave anyone behind. But peace didn't follow, not really. The Cold War began, a decades-long staring contest between East and West. Capitalism versus communism. Bombs pointed fingers on buttons, Children taught to duck under desks as if that would save them from nuclear fire. Meanwhile, the world kept turning. Nations once colonized rose up, demanded freedom, fought for it, won it, sometimes, lost it often, because independence didn't always come with stability, and old empires rarely left cleanly. Civil rights movements shook the foundations of privilege. In the United States, Black Americans marched, not for favors, but for rights, for the simple radical idea that being human should be enough. Women demanded more than a seat. They wanted voice, control, freedom. In every corner of the world, people stood up and said, no more. But the century wasn't done. Vietnam, Korea, the Middle East, proxy wars and broken treaties, coups dressed up as liberation. Liberation that looked like occupation. Progress that came with a price tag or a warhead. Technology soared. The moon was touched. Computers were born. The internet whispered across phone lines, and yet poverty remained. Inequality widened, and war never truly left. Because no matter how smart we became, how connected, how advanced, we still struggled with the oldest questions. Who gets to live well? Who gets to decide? Who is remembered and who is erased? Let's pause here. So here we are, the 21st century, the so-called modern age, the future, wrapped in pixels and push notifications, where coffee orders arrive by app, friends live inside screens, and artificial intelligence writes your emails, sometimes better than you do. We live in smart homes, wear smart watches, drive smart cars. Everything is smart, except occasionally us. Because for all the speed, for all the data, for all the miracles of engineering and code, something ancient still lingers beneath the touchscreens. The past. We didn't leave it behind. We repackaged it, rebranded it, subscribed to it monthly. Let's start with power. It no longer wears a crown. It doesn't need to. Now it wears a logo, a clean font, a privacy policy you never read. Today's emperors are corporate. They track your steps, your searches, your sleepless 3 a.m., Google spirals. They know what you bought, what you almost bought, what you whispered to no one. That's not magic. It's monetization. The feudal system is back. But this time, you sign the terms of service. We think we're free because we can choose between 20 flavors of toothpaste, because our devices come in 6 colors, because we can stream anything except maybe a moment of silence. But let's not pretend. Millions still work jobs they hate to afford lives they can barely live. The rich keep getting richer, not because they work harder, but because the system was built to make sure they never fall. Hedge funds gamble. The rest of us pay the bill. Wealth isn't just growing, it's hoarding. In a world where a single man can buy a planet and another can't afford insulin, we should probably stop calling it progress without some very large asterisks. And war, oh, it's still here. It just learned new tricks. Drones that kill without warning. Cyber attacks that never make the news. Propaganda disguised as memes. Wars fought in deserts and timelines. Casualties that disappear into acronyms. Civilians still die, still flee, still hope someone notices before the next trending topic takes over. We've grown desensitized. We doom scroll. We hashtag our empathy. We move on. Because there's always another outrage waiting. Another tragedy queued up like a next episode. And the environment, that ancient, generous, astonishing thing we've treated like an infinite resource, it's breaking. The ice caps are melting faster than our political will. Oceans are warming, species are disappearing, and the air we breathe is becoming a luxury in some cities. We were given a paradise. We handed it to corporations and said, please make this profitable. And now we ask, how did it get this bad? History doesn't just repeat, it echoes, louder each time. Remember how previous empires fell? Corruption, hubris, economic collapse, environmental neglect, social unrest. We're checking all the boxes, just with better Wi-Fi. And still, we pretend it's fine, because pretending is easier. Because facing the truth means responsibility. It means action. It means giving up convenience. And we are very bad at giving up anything we like, even when it's killing us. Education was supposed to be the answer, but even knowledge has been commodified. Paywalls guard science. Misinformation spreads faster than truth because it's shinier, scarier, and algorithmically favored. We have more access to facts than any generation before us, and somehow more confusion. Because facts aren't the problem, trust is. And when trust breaks, everything shakes. We start questioning elections, science, each other. We start turning inward, building walls, drawing lines, and history reminds us what comes next: division, violence, collapse. But here's the twist: it doesn't have to, because we're not just inheritors of the past, we're authors of the future. Yes, history has been cruel, complicated, and relentless, but it's also been resilient. Humans have survived plagues, tyrants, disasters of every scale, and still found ways to build, to hope, to laugh. We've created art in ashes, music in trenches, poetry in prison cells. We are, despite it all, brilliantly stubborn, and that matters. Because this story isn't over. This chapter we're living, yes, it's messy, conflicted, overstimulated, but it's still being written. We can choose better leaders, demand smarter systems, raise kindred children, care more. We can rethink power, reclaim truth, rebuild trust, but we have to try. Not once, not in a flash of outrage, but over and over and over again, because history doesn't belong to the victors. It belongs to the ones who remember. Let's pause here. Look around for a moment, not just your phone, not just the walls of your room, but the world behind it. The billions of people, the endless cities, the mountains carved by time, and the satellites quietly blinking above the clouds. It's still here. We're still here. And that somehow is a miracle. Because if you look back, truly back, across the pages of history, across the blood and brilliance, across the chaos and courage, it's hard to understand how we made it. We were never promised survival. From the earliest moments, we were fragile. Hairless, barefoot creatures chasing mammoths with sticks, huddling around fires, praying to stars we didn't understand. We fought. We froze. We failed. We fell into wars, plagues, famines, floods, and philosophies that almost broke us. We built empires, only to watch them crumble beneath the weight of their own pride. We believed in gods that demanded sacrifice, in kings who claimed divine right, in borders drawn with shaking hands and sharper knives. And yet, we endured. Through every collapse, someone rebuilt. Through every silence, someone sang. Through every tyranny, someone whispered a better idea, and that whisper grew. We learned, clumsily, painfully, but we learned to write, to measure, to question, to heal, to imagine. We learned to shape stone into homes, language into poetry, and grief into art. We created machines that crossed oceans, then built ships to reach the stars. We stared into the heart of atoms and the edge of galaxies. We charted the blood in our veins and the stories in our genes. We made fire, then made the internet, then somehow used it to argue with strangers about pizza toppings. Humans are ridiculous, and humans are astonishing, because behind every monumental failure was someone trying to do better. Behind every invention was a person who stayed up too late, who worried they might be wrong, who dared to try anyway. History doesn't belong to the tyrants. It belongs to the tired teachers, the forgotten nurses, the quiet engineers, the poets who scribbled in margins, the farmers who planted trees they'd never see fully grown. And if history has taught us anything, it's that we're never too broken to begin again. Yes, we've repeated mistakes, far too often. We've allowed greed to mask itself as growth. We've let fear guide our policies. We've ignored the cries of the planet, the poor, the marginalized, the silenced. We've weaponized identity. We've made enemies out of neighbors. We've treated comfort as a right and compassion as optional. But still, here we are, with another chance, because every generation gets one. A moment to decide whether to follow the same grooves worn into the ground by centuries of missteps, or to step aside, to cut a new path. Not easy, not clean, but real. A path that asks, what do we owe each other? A path that remembers. Progress without empathy is just profit with better PR. Because we're connected now, deeply, uncomfortably, unavoidably. What happens in one part of the world echoes across the rest. A virus in a market becomes a global pause. A drought in one region sparks migration in another. An invention here shifts economies over there. We can't afford to think in kingdoms anymore. We're a species, a messy, passionate, infuriating, glorious species, and we only get one planet, one timeline, one shot. So maybe, just maybe, this is our moment to ask better questions. Not how do we dominate, but how do we protect? Not how do I win, but how do we heal? Not what can I take, but what can I leave better than I found it? Because when the dust settles, when the historians of tomorrow look back at us, at you, they won't just count inventions or GDP or digital clicks. They'll ask, did they care? Did they learn? Did they try? We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be honest about our past, about our present, about the quiet, urgent responsibility of being alive right now. This is our page in the story. Let's not waste it. Let's pause here. So here we are, at the end of the story, or rather at the end of this story, because history doesn't end. It lingers, it loops, it whispers through headlines, through lullabies, through the strange sense that we've been here before, even if we can't quite place it. But this is the final page of our journey. And after everything, after pyramids and plagues, after revolutions and renaissances, after trenches and treaties and trembling hands signing peace that never quite held, there's something quietly remarkable in this moment. You're still here, still breathing, still listening, still wondering how a species as flawed and fragile as ours managed to hold on through it all. Maybe that's the real miracle. Not the inventions or the empires, not the flags or the formulas, but the endurance, the astonishing, defiant endurance of being human. Because being human isn't easy. It means carrying the weight of the past, the shame, the scars, the unfinished business. It means knowing that people just like us once cheered for terrible things, that they believed deeply in ideas we now find cruel, that they were blind in ways we still are. But it also means something else. It means having the chance to be better. And that chance, that's the gift history gives us, if we're brave enough to accept it. Because once you've seen where we came from, it's harder to pretend that ignorance is innocence, that silence is safety, that the world just is this way and always will be. It won't, because it never has. The world is always becoming, and so are we. You don't have to be a revolutionary. You don't have to write laws or lead armies or land on the moon. You just have to care, to ask better questions, to be a little more honest, a little more kind, a little more awake. Because that's what changes the story. Not one big moment, but 1,000 small ones, 1,000 choices to listen, to speak, to build something that won't collapse under its own weight. The history books won't remember your name, but maybe someone will feel less alone because of you. Maybe someone will sleep easier, eat better, dream bigger, because of something you did that seemed small at the time. And if enough people do that, quietly, relentlessly, tenderly, that's a new chapter. A better one. One where progress isn't just for the powerful. One where justice isn't just decorative. One where the future is shaped not by fear or force, but by care. So let's remember the mistakes. Yes, the wars, the wounds, the ways we turned on each other when we could have turned toward. But let's also remember the light. The music that was written during siege, the art carved by hands that had known chains, the laughter that survived famine, the love letters smuggled between cells, because that's who we are too. We are more than our worst moments. We are more than the systems that failed us. We are more than the past would suggest. And tonight, as you settle into bed, remember this. The story is not over. You are still in it. And what you do matters, not someday, now. You matter. Because history is not just what happened, it's what we choose next. So close your eyes. Feel the weight of time settle around you, not heavy, but warm, like a blanket passed down through generations. Worn, but still here. Breathe in, breathe out. The world will keep spinning, the sun will rise, and tomorrow you'll wake up in a future that history never got to finish. You will finish it. And that's something worth dreaming about. Good night. Dưới đây là part 21, chương mới mở ra sau khi trang sử đã tạm khép lại. Một bước chuyển từ chuyện cũ sang chính cuộc đời bạn, như một cái gật đầu yên lặng giữa hai kẻ sống sót. You thought we were finished, and in a way we were. But some stories don't end, they echo. You see, when you spend this much time walking through the ruins and triumphs of the past, you begin to see a pattern, a pulse, a quiet message stitched between the wars and inventions and whispered revolutions. It was always about the future, not just survival, not just memory, but continuity, because every ancestor, every thinker, every rebel, every child who scribbled stars into cave walls, they were talking to you. Not directly, of course, but intentionally, urgently, as if they knew they'd never see tomorrow. But maybe you would. So let's talk about now. Not the abstract now of headlines and hashtags, but your now. The coffee cup near your bed, the noise outside your window, the thoughts rattling in your chest while you read this, the invisible weight of possibility that you carry, even when you're too tired to feel it. What do you do with it? Because here's the quiet truth. Everything we just covered, thousands of years of chaos and beauty, it all led here, not just to humanity as a whole, but to you, to this moment. And that means something. It means your life is not an accident. It means your choices are not irrelevant. It means you are not just watching history, you are inside it. You don't need to be a politician or an activist or a genius or a saint. You just need to be awake, to pay attention, to care in ways that inconvenience you, to love in ways that feel unreasonable, to reach for something better even when the world keeps whispering, this is all there is. Because it's not. There is more. There's the person you haven't met yet who needs you, the idea you haven't had yet that will change someone's life, the failure that will teach you everything, the quiet moment that will make it all feel worth it. This is not motivational fluff. It's math. If history teaches us anything, it's that nothing stays the same. Not forever, not even pain, not even systems. The worst empires fall, the coldest winters end, the longest silences break. So if you're scared, good. It means you're paying attention. If you're exhausted, of course you are. But you're here, still here. And the question becomes, what will you do with your part? Maybe you'll teach, maybe you'll write, maybe you'll rest and heal, and that healing will ripple outwards in ways you can't predict. Maybe you'll raise someone who does something extraordinary. Maybe you'll be the reason someone survives their hardest year. That's history too. Not the kind that gets printed, but the kind that lasts, the kind that builds slowly, day by day, choice by choice. So don't worry if your life doesn't look epic. Neither did theirs, until much later. Do you think the people who changed the world knew they were doing it? Most of them didn't. They were scared, angry, tired, overwhelmed, just trying to live. And then they did something small. They stood up when they were told to sit. They asked one more question. They opened their home. They refused to be silent. They spoke truth to someone who'd forgotten how to hear it, and history turned. Maybe just a little, maybe just enough. And one day, if someone looks back at this moment, at you, maybe they'll say, that's when things began to change. Let's pause here. Say continue when you're ready for part 22, where we stop looking back and finally start imagining what comes next. Let's do something dangerous. Let's imagine, not what has been, not what is, but what could be, because that's where history ends and something else begins. Not memory, but possibility. We've spent so many hours looking back, studying empires, revolutions, brilliance, horror, mistakes, and for good reason. The past is full of lessons, of warnings, of maps written in blood and brilliance. But the future has no script, and that's terrifying, but also freeing. Because what comes next isn't written in stone, it's written in choices, in conversations, in tiny acts of hope no one will ever put in a textbook. So let's ask the forbidden question. What if it goes right? What if we learn? What if we build cities that breathe, that listen, that shelter? What if our economies weren't measured by how much they grow, but by how many people stop suffering? What if schools taught empathy as fluently as math? What if technology stopped serving profits and started serving dignity? What if we treated clean water, safe housing, education, and peace not as luxuries, but as birthrights? What if kindness wasn't the exception? What if justice didn't come in pieces or delays or discounts? What if we stopped asking, how much does it cost, and started asking, who does this help? What if we designed systems not to control people, but to lift them? What if nations stopped acting like fortresses and started acting like neighbors? What if borders weren't battle lines? What if citizenship was a shared humanity? Yes, it sounds naive. Yes, it sounds impossible. But so did abolishing slavery. So did women voting. So did space travel. So did the internet. Every beautiful thing we've built started as a whisper the world called foolish, until it wasn't, until someone did the work, until others joined in, until it became normal. So let's not be afraid of foolish ideas. Let's be afraid of forgetting how to dream them. Let's be afraid of apathy, of cynicism disguised as wisdom, of people who laugh at hope because they forgot how heavy despair really is. Let's remember, the world doesn't need more cleverness. It needs care and courage. The courage to imagine systems that serve more than just shareholders. The courage to ask better questions, even when the answers are slow or uncomfortable. The courage to unlearn, to rebuild, to make space for those whose voices have been drowned for centuries. Because here's what the past taught us. Real change rarely starts from the top. It starts with the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones without armies, but with a refusal to give up. It starts with nurses in overworked clinics, with students who won't accept old lies, with parents who teach their children a better way to be strong, not with fists, but with integrity. It starts with stories, like this one, told in the dark, whispered before sleep, shared across time, not to entertain, but to remember and to remind that we are not alone, that others came before us, confused, terrified, hopeful, that they built what they could and handed it off to us. And now it's ours. The page is blank, the pen is warm, the ink is memory, but the words, those are yours to write. You won't get it right all the time, no one does. But maybe, if we write together, if we keep imagining, if we stay awake to what could be, then one day, long from now, someone will whisper this story again and they'll say softly, that's when the world began to change. Let's rest here. We've reached the end, at least the end of this particular road. But you already know, history doesn't really end. Not the way books do. It doesn't close neatly, it lingers, shifts, breathes, it spills into every hallway of the present, taps softly on the shoulder of tomorrow. But for now, let's sit in this space together, not to summarize, not to explain, but simply to be. You've traveled through centuries, you've seen the rise and ruin of civilizations, the sparks of resistance, the long, quiet arc of change. You've followed people who stood, people who fell, people who were forgotten, and others who will never be. And now there are no more battles to recount, no more revolts to analyze, no more plagues, pyramids, or parliaments waiting in the wings. Now there's only this. You. Here. Alive. In a room that may be small, quiet, cluttered. Maybe you're wrapped in blankets, maybe sitting in silence, maybe barely keeping your eyes open. But regardless of where you are physically, you're here. And that matters. Because we spend so much time in history talking about kings, generals, revolutions, we forget the power of presence, of simply being a person in a moment, awake, aware. You are that person. And this flicker of now is sacred, not because of any grand achievement, but because you made it here, through all of it, through your own story, which no historian may ever write, but which has shaped the world in ways you can't yet see. Let me remind you, you carry history in your body, in your breath, in your grief, in the way you laugh, in the language you think in the fears you inherited, in the hopes you protect like fragile glass. Every step you take, every word you speak, every time you choose compassion instead of indifference, you're shaping the next chapter. And no one else can do it like you. You are not the echo of the past. You are its evolution. And yes, life is hard. That's not poetic. That's truth. There are days when the weight of being alive is crushing, when the world feels too loud, too sharp, too broken to fix, when the past feels like a chain instead of a compass. But even then, especially then, remember this. You are not alone. You never were. Behind you stand generations who made it through war, hunger, silence, and shame. They may not have had your tools, your freedoms, your voice, but they reached towards something anyway. And now you are the extension of that reach. You are the unfinished sentence. You are the breath they didn't get to take. So take it, breathe in, breathe out, feel the strange, beautiful weight of continuity, the way the past lives in you, the way the future quietly waits for your next move. And no, you don't have to save the world, you just have to show up in it, fully, imperfectly, with heart. You just have to choose not to look away, not to forget, not to pretend the story was ever someone else's, because it's always been yours. Every quiet act of resistance, every hard conversation, every time you offer kindness when it's least expected, every night you stay up just to keep someone company, that's history too. The soft kind, the slow kind, the kind that doesn't make headlines but rewrites the future anyway. So when the world feels unchangeable, remember, it's always changing. When you feel too small, remember, you're made of everything that survived. And when you feel tired, remember, rest is not quitting. Even the stars have to cool before they shine. So rest now, not as an end, but as a promise, that you'll rise tomorrow not with perfection, but with presence, that you'll carry the story forward, that you'll add your line, your color, your voice, and that someday, long from now, when someone asks what happened next, the answer will be, you did. So close your eyes, not in defeat, but in reverence for the people who came before, for the world you're helping shape, for the quiet power of one moment, one life, one you. History got us here, but now it's your turn. Write well, dream deeply, and when you're ready, wake up. The future is waiting. No more stories tonight, no more kings or queens, no fallen cities, no whispered rebellions or forgotten gods. Tonight, there is only silence. A silence that doesn't demand anything from you. A silence that holds you, not like a question, but like a lullaby. Because you've done enough. You've listened. You've carried time on your back like a traveler with no map. You've followed us through dynasties and dust, through ancient wars and modern fears, through the strange, messy miracle of being human. Now it's time to let it all fall away. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to solve the puzzles. You don't even need to be awake anymore. All you need is this moment, this breath, this bed, this version of yourself that has made it despite everything to the edge of another night. That's something. You made it. And now, in the hush that follows the final word, you are allowed to stop holding it all together. Let your mind unspool gently. Let your muscles soften like old rope finally given slack. No one needs you right now. Not the future, not the past, just this small sliver of now which exists only so you can rest. You might be thinking about your own story, about choices, about regrets, about the parts of yourself still trying to learn how to be. That's okay. You don't have to resolve any of it tonight. In fact, I hope you don't, because sleep isn't for answers. It's for surrender, for floating, for giving your tired thoughts a place to drift, like paper boats on quiet water. You don't have to impress anyone here. You don't have to be wise or strong or productive. You don't even have to dream. You can just be, like the people before you, like the nameless billions who once sat beneath stars wondering if tomorrow would be kind. You are not separate from them. Your breath is their breath. Your rest is their legacy. You carry their survival in your DNA, so sleep for them. Sleep for the ones who never could. Sleep for the ones who stayed awake to protect, to labor, to wait for morning that never came. Tonight, the world can turn without your help. The emails can wait, the news can fade, the unfinished thoughts can dissolve like fog when the sun rises. There is no test here, no deadline, no spotlight. Just the sound of your breath, just the warmth of this moment, just the quiet permission to be nobody in particular, which is secretly the most sacred thing you can be. You are not here to perform. You are here to restore, to repair the gentle wires inside you that fray with every day lived under gravity, to remind your body that it belongs to you, to remind your soul that stillness is a kind of rebellion too. So if your thoughts are still racing, don't fight them. Let them walk past like strangers on a street you'll never visit again. You don't need to greet them. You don't need to follow. They'll pass, and you'll remain. Still, heavy, safe. It's strange, isn't it? How quiet the world becomes when we finally stop demanding sound from it. How soft the night feels when we stop trying to stay awake through it. You're not behind, you're not broken, you're just tired. And tired things deserve to rest. You've given this day everything you had. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if it didn't feel like enough, even if all you did was survive it, that's still something. That's still worthy. So let go of the things you didn't say, of the things you wish you'd done, of the things tomorrow might demand from you. You don't have to carry them to bed. You don't have to carry anything to bed, only yourself. And even that, only gently. Curl in, exhale, float, let the world fall away until it's just a distant hum. You are not responsible for it right now. The universe will go on spinning, galaxies will continue expanding, tides will rise and fall, and not a single one of those things needs your permission. So rest. Let your mind become a quiet house with every light off. Let your dreams wander wherever they please, without plot, without logic, without pressure, or dream of nothing at all. Just space, just warmth, just the slow, simple, sacred fact that you are still here. And that's enough, more than enough. So, good night. Sleep well. The story is sleeping too. This is the last one, not because we've run out of things to say, but because there's nothing left to chase. There's no more history to uncover, no more battles to explain, no more leaders to question, or kingdoms to watch rise and fall. Tonight is not for learning, it's for letting go. And so, if you're still here, if you've followed this journey through every flicker of time and truth, then this part is just for you. No metaphors, no lessons, just breath, stillness, and a little room to exist. You don't need to understand anything right now. You don't need to prepare for anything. There's no next step, no challenge waiting in the wings. There's just this moment, a quiet space between all the noise of being human. So I want you to imagine something with me, not a city or a war or a distant piece of history, just this, a room, still, dimly lit, familiar. You're lying down, soft fabric against your skin, a gentle rhythm of breath in your chest. Outside, maybe there's a breeze, or nothing at all. And the only sound that matters is silence, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you, the kind that holds you like a friend who knows when not to speak, the kind that says you've done enough, because you have. You've made it through hard days. You've said hard goodbyes. You've sat with uncertainty, with fear, with decisions you weren't ready for. You've carried grief that didn't have a name. You've laughed on days when you thought you'd never smile again. You've loved people who didn't stay. You've stayed when it would have been easier to leave. You've lived. Not perfectly, not without pain, but truly. And that's what matters. Because history is full of people doing their best with what they had. And tonight, you are one of them. You are part of a long, winding, fragile, brilliant story of survival. Not of nations or empires, but of individuals. Of people who chose to wake up again, even when the world didn't make it easy. So tonight, you don't have to be strong. You don't have to make meaning out of everything. You don't have to hold it all together. You just have to rest. Not the kind of rest that rushes you into sleep. The deeper kind. The kind where your mind stops bracing for impact. Where your heartbeat stops asking, what now? Where you remember that your worth is not something you earn. It's something you already carry in every breath, every scar, every quiet decision to stay kind, even when you could have chosen bitterness. Even now, as you lie here unsure whether you're tired or just numb. This moment is yours. You don't need to be useful. You don't need to be productive. You just need to be. And yes, the world is complicated. Yes, the problems are enormous, but rest is not retreat. Rest is resistance. It's your body saying, I need a pause, and you listening. So give in, not with guilt, with grace. Let yourself unravel a little. Let the tight edges soften. Let the what-ifs and should-haves drift into the dark where they lose their shape. There's no pressure here, no agenda, no audience. Just you, here, breathing, and me beside you saying quietly, it's okay. It's okay not to have the answer. It's okay not to finish the list. It's okay not to feel okay. What you are is enough, more than enough. You don't need to earn peace. You've already earned the right to close your eyes without explanation, so do it. Let your eyelids fall like curtains on a long day. Let your limbs get heavier with each breath. Let the stories dissolve. Let your name become quiet inside your own mind. You are not gone. You are just resting, fully, finally, freely. And when the morning comes, you'll wake. Not changed, maybe, but steadier, calmer, slightly more whole. And that too will be enough. So sleep now. No more history. No more chapters. Just you here, alive and deeply, quietly at peace. Good night. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. This hasn't just been a story about history. It's been a journey through time, through memory, through what it means to be human. And if it resonated with you, even just a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Share what parts stayed with you, what moment made you pause, what piece of the past felt oddly familiar. I read every single one, and your words are part of what keeps this project alive. And if this story helped you breathe a little easier tonight, if it gave your mind something soft to land on, please consider subscribing to the channel. That way you'll never miss the next tale, the next whisper in the dark, because there are always more stories. More echoes to follow, more truths to uncover, more moments to share in the quiet. So for now, rest. Thank you for your time, your presence, your beautiful attention. Sleep well, be safe. And I'll see you next time when the lights dim again and the story begins.